And joining us on the line now from Washington, D.C., Dr. Leonard Sax. He is the author of Boys Adrift and the founder of the National Association for Single-Sex Public Education. Dr. Sax, good to have you on TVO. How are you tonight?
Thanks for inviting me.
I want to start by getting into some discussion about Boys Adrift, in which you deal with what you call the epidemic of unmotivated boys and underachieving young men. There's lots to unpack there, so let's start. Generally, I want to start by finding out what you have discovered as the prime reason for the lack of motivation in young boys.
Well, I would first point out that this phenomenon does not affect every boy. I use the term epidemic. I'm a medical doctor. When a doctor uses the term epidemic, we understand that doesn't involve 100% of the population. No epidemic does. In fact, very few epidemics even involve 50% of the population. But if you look around Canada, look around the United States, what you find is a growing proportion of young men who are not working up to their potential, who are not motivated the way their sisters are.
And hit me with a checklist of some of the reasons behind that.
Well, let me start by explaining how we know that this is so. A very good article that just went up on the Statistics Canada website, statcan.ca, looked at who's attending universities across all the provinces. And what these authors found is that over the last 30 years, there's been a really profound shift, stunning reversal is the term that they used, in who's attending Canadian universities. 30 years ago, more than 60% of graduates from Canadian universities were men. Now, well over 60% of graduates, over 60% of graduates nationwide are women. Now, I hasten to add, the fact that more women are attending and graduating from university is not a problem. On the contrary, it's cause for celebration. The question is, why aren't their brothers keeping up with them? So, for example, you ask the question, who's dropping out of Canadian universities? 30 years ago, women were more than twice as likely as men not to finish their studies. Today, across Canada, men are almost 3 times more likely than women to drop out of Canadian universities, not to complete their studies. And one thing that impressed me about this particular publication on the StatCan website was that the authors correctly recognized that this problem doesn't begin at university. This problem begins early, at age 6 or 7 years of age. This growing phenomenon of boys who regard academic achievement as unmasculine, doing well in school as something that girls do.
Well, in fact, let me share with you and our viewers some numbers that we have. These are from the EQAO, as we call it here in the province of Ontario, the Ontario Education Quality and Accountability Office. And these are grade 3 and grade 6 test scores. Let's start with reading and writing assessment in Ontario. This is grade 3 girls who meet or exceed the provincial standards. For reading, it's 68%. For writing, it's 73%. How about for grade 3 boys? Much lower, 56% for reading, 56% for writing. And how about for grade 6 now? Girls who are at or above the provincial standards for reading, 70%. For writing, 72%. For grade 6 boys, at or above the provincial standards, reading only 59%, and writing only 50%. All right, let's get into some explanation for why this is.
Well, you'll notice that the gap at grade 6 is a little bit larger than the gap at grade 3. And this is very robust finding as you look around North America, that the longer kids are in school, the more likely the boys are to regard academic achievement as unmasculine, the bigger that gap gets. And the higher you look in terms of academic achievement, the bigger the gap is. So if you're just looking at minimum proficiency, the gap will tend to be large. But you ask the question, who's graduating with honors from university, or who are the top 10 students at the high school? That's where you see a very large gender gap. And you go around the province, you ask people at the public schools, who were your top 10 students last year? And you find 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 of the top students were girls.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and what I need to get is a better understanding of why this is the way it is. What's going on inside the brains of younger boys that apparently makes some, you say in epidemic numbers, and admittedly that's not 100% of society, but what makes a growing number, and a disturbing growing number, either unable or unwilling to be educated the way the girls are?
Right, a growing proportion. That is, many more boys today compared with 30 years ago tend to regard school and academic achievement at school as unmasculine. So the issues that I address in the book, Boys Adrift, is what has changed over the last 30 years that might account for the very profound shift we see in the attitudes of young men today compared with young men of 30 years ago. And I identify 5 different factors, one of which is changes at school, another of which is changes in the culture. 30, 40 years ago, throughout North America, we had a culture where doing well in school was a good thing for a boy. So 40 years ago in the United States, we had a black man, Sam Cooke, had a #1 song. Don't know much about history, he says, and he admits he's not an A student, but he says, I'm trying to be. He says, I'm trying to be an A student because maybe by being an A student, baby, I could win your love for me. He mentioned specifically geometry, French, and trigonometry as subjects where he's going to work harder. He's going to try to get an A because he believes that improving himself, getting an A instead of a B, will raise his status in the eyes of the pretty girls. Now, I don't think you can imagine Akon or 50 Cent or Justin Timberlake saying, I'm going to try harder on my French examination and try to get an A instead of a B because I think getting a better grade will raise my status in the eyes of the pretty girls. There's been a profound shift in the popular culture over 30 years ago. What Akon and 50 Cent most want you to know about themselves is that they are ex-cons, that they were convicted of grand theft auto in the case of Akon. The culture has shifted away from the culture we had 30 years ago, where academic achievement was celebrated, to the culture we have today, where the cool thing for a young man to be is to be convicted of a felony.
No, I understand culturally that's where things are at, but how about physiologically in the brain? Is there something going on in the brain that kind of disagrees in young boys with the way they're being educated today?
Well, of course, brain development hasn't changed. DNA doesn't change in 30 or 40 years, but education has changed. In particular, in Ontario and in arguably all the provinces, and certainly throughout the United States, there has been an acceleration of the early elementary curriculum. Today, we ask 5-year-olds to do what 30 or 40 years ago we asked 6-year-olds to do. So you imagine going into a classroom 40 years ago and seeing what they were doing with 5-year-olds. It would have been a very diverse range of activities, singing, dancing, drawing, and a little bit of formal didactic instruction sitting down. But that would have been a small part of the day 40 years ago in, say, a senior kindergarten. Today, a senior kindergarten looks very much like grade 1. That is, they are sitting and they're learning to read and write. We're asking the 5-year-olds to do what we used to ask 6-year-olds to do. Now, that might seem like a small change, but that change occurred without any awareness of understanding of the profound differences in the trajectories of brain development in 5- and 6-year-old girls and boys. We now understand that it is not developmentally appropriate for many 5-year-old boys to ask them to sit still and be quiet. And you go into a public school and asked to see the senior kindergarten at these co-ed schools, what do you see? The teacher is saying, Justin, why are you standing? Would you please sit down? Jason, are you making a buzzing noise? Could you please stop that? Damien, the widgeting and the fidgeting in your chair is very distracting. Now, boys, look at Emily. She's being so good. She's sitting still and being quiet. Is that so much to ask? Can't you just please sit still and be quiet? And the message boys now get from their first experience at age 5 is that doing well in school means being more like a girl and less like a boy. Well, boys don't want to be girls, and girls don't want to be boys. And boys today, from their first experience of formal education, now are getting a message that boys were not getting 30 years ago, namely, that doing well in school is unmasculine, that doing well in school is something that girls do. And that's one part of one factor that has contributed to this phenomenon.
So 2 possible approaches then. Number 1, do you want to start boys in school later? Or number 2, do you want to allow them the right to jump up and down every now and then?
Well, certainly one recommendation I make in the book is if they're going to have senior kindergarten in 2008 look like grade 1 in 1978, then by all means enroll your boy at age 6 rather than age 5, and I give many examples of boys who've really benefited from that. Another is, as you said, okay, let the boys jump up and down. The problem is in a co-ed classroom, that's not fair to the girls because the classroom that works best for most classrooms, for most girls rather, the classroom environment that works best for most girls is a quiet classroom that's free of distractions. And if Emily is sitting here and Justin on her left is jumping up and down and Jason on her right is twirling and making buzzing noises, Emily's going to say, look, I can't concentrate. And that's why the single-sex format makes a lot of sense and indeed is being used in schools around Ontario with real success, where you offer the girls a girls' classroom, a boys classroom, and then you can customize what you're doing to what works best for girls and what works best for boys.
I know you are a champion of the single-sex approach. I also want to read you something that was written in The Observer a couple of years ago by Rosalind Chait Barnett, who said the following, and you may have seen it in the past. She says, there are a number of best-selling authors that say there are important gender differences in the brain and auditory system, such that girls and boys see the world differently, so are best educated in single-sex schools. I have studied it, she says, and concluded that the arguments are not substantiated and miss the bigger agenda in this country, she means America. Race and social class are far better predictors of outcomes. What's your response to her?
Well, if you look very superficially at surface parameters like high school graduation rates, then it's very easy to conclude in the United States, certainly, that the important issue is not sex, but race and class. So, for example, a very superficial parameter, who graduates from high schools in the United States? A black boy growing up in a low-income neighborhood in the United States is more likely to go to prison than he is to go to college or university. Which is a shameful fact for our country, but it's true. A white boy growing up in affluent suburbs is certainly going to graduate from high school, and he's certainly going to go on to college or university. The only reason he wouldn't is if his parents' checks bounce. So if you just look at a very crude and superficial parameter like who's graduating from high school, then it's very easy to draw the conclusion that Rosalind Chait Barnett and Carol Rivers and Sarah Mead have drawn, which is that gender doesn't matter. But if you dig a little deeper and you ask questions like, well, who's doing well in high school? Who's doing well at university? Who's graduating from university? For example, in the United States, who graduates? If a boy enrolls in a university in the United States, what's the likelihood that he will graduate in 4 years' time? 29%. What's the likelihood that he will ever graduate in any amount of time? Less than 50%. For girls, those figures are 60% and 70% respectively. And likewise, who's graduating with honors? The New York Times had a very good article on this where they looked around the United States. Who's graduating with honors from American universities? They found nationwide something like 4 out of 5 students graduating with honors are women. Again, a profound shift from 30 years ago. So if you dig a little deeper and you ask the question, who's doing well? Who's motivated? Then you find that this gender gap is manifest in every demographic group, but it manifests differently. Again, if you look at black or Spanish-speaking boys in low-income neighborhoods, they disengage very early. They're unlikely, less than 50% will ever graduate from high school. If you look at the white boys in the suburbs, they'll graduate from high school, they'll go on to college or university, but you still see that gap in motivation. So much so that in the United States today, and this is the work of Andrew Beveridge in New York City, looking nationwide, demographer at the City University of New York, he has found that young women today in the United States are earning more than young men are because the young women are so much more likely to be college or university educated.
But speak to the issue which I'm sure many of your critics have said to you in the past, which is if you separate the genders at elementary or high school age, they will not have the experience with their opposite sex, and that will somehow affect them adversely later in life as they go along.
Certainly, or as I said to a parent in my own practice 7 years ago, I said to her, Mrs. Yost, the real world is co-ed. Kids need to learn how to get along with the opposite sex. School should prepare kids for the real world. The real world's co-ed, therefore school should be co-ed. And Mrs. Yost said to me, Dr. Sax, you have no idea what you're talking about. Because that argument is based on the assumption that the co-ed school is something like the real world. It's not. A co-ed school is a very peculiar universe where what really counts is who's cute and who likes who. This is not my assessment. I'll give you one illustration. team of American psychologists went to Belfast in Northern Ireland, because Belfast is one of only a handful of cities around the world where kids are randomly assigned to single-sex or co-ed schools, can be randomly assigned. And that's because Belfast has a great many single-sex public schools. So they found a cohort of girls who had indeed been randomly assigned to the girls' public school or the co-ed public school. And they found that for girls at a co-ed public school, you ask them a bunch of questions, you know, you do well in school, are you good at sport, do you think you're pretty? For girls at a co-ed school, you only need to ask one question to know that girl's self-esteem. Are you pretty? If you're pretty and you're at a co-ed school, life is good. The boys rush to open the door for you. The other girls see that. That raises your status in the eyes of the other girls. Doesn't matter if you're flunking all your courses. Doesn't matter if you're no good at sport. Doesn't matter if you don't get along with your parents. If you're pretty, you're royalty. Now, the flip side of that is that the boys don't think you're pretty. And you're walking down the hallway and a boy says, "Oh gosh, such a whale, and your face looks like a pizza." Which is boy talk, means you're overweight and you have acne. And some boys talk that way. Not all boys are gentlemen. Now, that girl doesn't care what that particular boy says. She loathes and detests that boy. But when the other girls see how the boys disrespect you, it lowers your status in the eyes of the other girls. Doesn't matter if you're a straight-A student. Doesn't matter if you're best at sport. Doesn't matter. At the co-ed school, these researchers found, the focus is on how you look, not on who you are. But at the girls' schools, they found that was not the case. At girls' schools, in the public sector, from the same neighborhood, self-esteem was a complex product of many different factors. You're getting good grades? Good, that helped. That was positively correlated with self-esteem, which was not the case at co-ed schools. Are you good at sport? Good, that helped. You get along with your parents? Good, that helped. Are you pretty? Well, good, that helped. That was positively correlated with self-esteem, but it wasn't the most important correlation. It wasn't even one of the top three. At the girls' schools, the focus is on who you are. Are you a good friend? Do you return your phone calls? Do you show up when you say you're going to show up? At the co-ed schools, the focus is on how you look. I think a very good case can be made that a single-sex school is actually better preparation for the real world than the co-ed school, because in most real-world jobs, unless you're an actor or model or anchor for a TV news show, those aren't real-world jobs. In most real-world jobs, the focus is not on how you look. The focus is on who you are. Do you show up for work on time? Can you meet a deadline? Do you get the job done? That's all more important than whether or not you're skinny and you have nice skin. And furthermore, we're not suggesting that girls and boys be separated. We're saying that schools should offer many opportunities for girls and boys to have activities together. We're not advocates of convents or monasteries, but we're saying, hey, the best way to learn French is in a classroom where the focus is on learning French rather than on seeing whether or not Emily likes Justin.
At what age would you separate the genders in terms of their educational careers, and at what age would you let them get back together?
Well, again, I always am stressing that we're not separating genders at any age. The schools I advise, we always have lots of activities where girls and boys are doing all kinds of things together, whether that's community service, plays, musicals, lots of activities together. But the single-sex classrooms in the core subject areas, this is where there's been a real change in our understanding. 20 years ago, people might have answered that question by saying, oh, secondary school, teenagers, you know, teenage girls are going to distract teenage boys are going to distract teenage girls, and so forth. But what the research is showing us is that, as true as that may be, the benefits are even greater for the youngest students. And this actually is where the brain research helps us to understand some of these findings, because looking at the brain research, we see that the differences between a 6-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy in terms of how the brain looks is much larger than the difference between a 17-year-old girl and a 17-year-old boy. And that's unexpected. That was not the conventional wisdom or expectation 20 or even 10 years ago. So there are benefits at the high school level, certainly, but the benefits are even greater early in the primary years.
So separate them as of grade 1 or 2, and then you let them come back together?
12.
Sorry? K through 12?
K through 12.
All the way through?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Part of what you're telling us today speaks to the notion that we can't treat boys and girls the same. We've got to treat them differently because they are different, and there's no point in treating them exactly the same throughout their educational careers.
No, I don't agree with you.
No?
What I'm saying is, look, if you live in Toronto and you think that your son might do better in a boys' school, you have all sorts of options. You've got Upper Canada College, St. Andrews College, Crescent Academy, Chaminade, Brebeuf. These are all wonderful schools, and I visited them. And I'm very impressed. If you think your daughter belongs in a girls' school, you've got Branksome Hall, Bishop Strachan, et cetera, et cetera. One little problem. Most of the schools I mentioned, you're going to have to pay $20,000 a year or more. We're not saying every child should be in a single-sex classroom. We're saying there's lots of variation among girls and among boys. We're not saying all boys are one way and all girls are another way. Absolutely not. We're saying some girls might do better in a girls' classroom. Some boys might do better in a boys' classroom. Some might do better in a co-ed classroom. All our association is saying is that parents should have a choice. Even if they don't have $20,000 a year to spend on their kids' education, they ought to have a choice in the Toronto District School Board to send their child to a girls' public school or a boys' public school.
Dr. Leonard Sax, it's good of you to join us on the line from Washington, D.C. Thanks so much.
Thanks again for inviting me.